may have just heard the recording start, which is my next part. We will be recording this evening's presentation. So if you do have to step away or you miss anything, it will be available on the Future Energy Systems YouTube channel, which I will send out in a follow-up email, not immediately, because of course, turnaround time on videos takes a little bit. So don't go looking for it immediately after, but it will be available eventually for you to watch. We will be recording the presentation and the speaker primarily. So during the question period, which we will have, you can certainly pop up on screen and ask your question yourself. And if you would rather not have that audio included, you can just let us know. Or the chat is here, and myself and Valerie, who I'll pass it over to in a second from Future Energy Systems, are happy to ask the questions that you have if you don't want to be on audio or video. So that is what we're here to do. So little bit more housekeeping. Like I said, I am from the Edmonton Public Library. I'm very excited to be partnered with Future Energy Systems on EnergyTalks, our speaker series. My role tonight is to support you any way that you need. If you have tech issues, you have my email and phone number from sending out the reminder yesterday. Get in touch with me. I'm happy to get you reconnected. If you have any issues, pop in the chat, and I'm happy to support you in any way that I can. I mentioned questions already. There will be time in the middle and at the end to ask any questions you may have. But if you think of questions throughout the presentation, throw them in the chat. Valerie and myself will do our best to capture as many of them as we can and make sure they get asked when appropriate. And I just want to mention that this is just one of many speaker series that we do at the Edmonton Public Library. And I encourage you, if you enjoy this evening or are just looking for learning opportunities, to check them all out. I will pop a link in the chat and you can see what we are offering. I am going to pass it over to Valerie Miller with Future Energy Systems to introduce speaker series, the land acknowledgement, and then introduce our speaker this evening.
Thank you so much, Cassidy and the Edmonton Public Library. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We know this is going to be a really interesting session, but as Cassidy said, just a couple more announcements and then we'll get right into it. So the first thing we want to do is a land acknowledgement. So the University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant communities. And think about where you are yourself tonight and whose land you are on. So I am in Ontario on Treaty 18 land, and I'd like to acknowledge that. We are here from Future Energy Systems, which was launched in 2016 with a $75 million grant from the Government of Canada's Canada First Research Excellence Fund to help Canada transition to a low net carbon energy economy. We focus on multidisciplinary research that develops the energy technologies of the near future, integrates them into today's infrastructure, and examines possible consequences for our society, economy, and environment. We also contribute to the development of solutions for challenges presented by current energy systems. In Future Energy Systems, we have over 100 research projects, 140 researchers, and over 700 graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and highly qualified personnel, one of which you will get to meet tonight. We do wish to remind current and future viewers that the opinions expressed by the speaker are not necessarily those of the Edmonton Public Library, Future Energy Systems, or the University of Alberta. And I don't want to take any more time, so I'm going to invite Bandita to come up on screen. So tonight we have Bandita Deka-Kalita, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Strategy, Entrepreneurship, and Management at the Alberta School of Business. Welcome, Bandita. We are so excited to learn about your research tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, Valerie. As Valerie said, my name is Bandita Deka-Kalita, and it is a great pleasure and a privilege to be here today and to have the opportunity to present some of the research that I have been doing over the past 3 years towards my PhD dissertation. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Okay. Just give me a moment here. Okay, so hopefully we can progress through this presentation without technical glitches that sometimes accompany these virtual presentations. I wanted to start off by introducing my presentation. So the title of my presentation is Remaking Worth: What We Can Learn from the Transformation of Alberta's Oil and Gas Industry's Organizing Principle. So the phrase remaking worth encapsulates our findings about the process of logic transformation, which I hope will become clearer through the course of the presentation today. This project is a joint effort with my PhD supervisor, Professor Joel Gaiman. I am a third-year PhD candidate at the Alberta School of Business, about to start my fourth year this fall. To provide a background for our work, I wanted to start off by drawing your attention towards this photograph of an orphaned energy site near St. Albert in Alberta, belonging to a company called Redwater Energy. Now, some of us might recall the name of this company from a decision of the Supreme Court of Canada that was very highly talked about in the beginning of 2019. So this company had gone bankrupt in 2015, and the Supreme Court overturned 2 interim decisions by lower courts and ruled in January 2019 that energy companies must fulfill their environmental obligations before paying back creditors in the case of insolvency or bankruptcy. So in sum, this decision concerning Redwater Energy was a milestone event for oil and gas companies in Alberta, because it said that companies must clean up after themselves, an issue that had been in the thick of media attention for quite some time already in Alberta. So essentially, this decision reinstated that honoring end-of-life commitments was most important and legally required of oil and gas companies in Alberta. So I open with this image tonight to underline one aspect of the central puzzle that has motivated my research in this context, the fact that Alberta's attention was drawn to the growing inventory of retiring oil and gas assets. The problem of inactive and abandoned oil wells is today exceptionally pronounced in Alberta, while in neighboring BC, there's approximately 16,000 of these retired liabilities, and in Saskatchewan, there are around 75,000. Estimates from the Alberta Energy Regulator put Alberta at approximately 168,000. So these inactive and unretired wells, alongside other aging oil and gas infrastructure, present health, safety, and environmental risks through surface, soil, and groundwater contamination, as well as leakages of methane gas, a potent greenhouse gas emission. However, apart from the environmental issues, other issues have also been highlighted across the years. In this slide, I have compiled a few clippings from newspaper and magazine articles that have pointed out these issues across the years. As these various clippings will appear on this slide, I want to draw your attention to different facets of organizational life that these issues seem to have touched. For example, different estimates of financial obligations posed by these liabilities have been put forward. These estimates range from approximately $40 billion to $260 billion in total. Different timelines have been estimated. Various stakeholders that have been or that will be affected by this issue have been identified. For example, farmers, landowners, rural municipalities, environmentalists, etc. Lots of academics are becoming interested in this problem, and it is a problem of political significance as well, and has made headlines consistently for many years now, certainly for the last few years that I have been following it. So these issues motivated me to delve deeper into the topic of inactive, abandoned, suspended, and orphaned wells in Alberta. In sum then, across Alberta, the increase in these liabilities is a widespread and burgeoning issue. To put things into perspective, these burgeoning issues related to environmental considerations are not exactly unique to Alberta. such considerations seem to have transformed how the overall oil and gas industry is perceived in the world in present times. So as Daniel Yergin, the author of Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Prize, has put it, for most of the 20th century, growing reliance on petroleum was celebrated as a good and as a progress of human and as a symbol of human progress. But in the 21st century, the oil and gas industry, or the petroleum industry, has found itself on the defensive, charged with being a threat to present and future generations. We became interested in understanding how the oil industry got there. How did the oil and gas industry go from being a celebrated symbol of progress to a threat to present and future generations? So the issues that have surfaced in Alberta's oil and gas industry, are a matter of grave concern for policy, and the scale of these issues is only expected to grow, posing a clear and present grand challenge to all involved. Now, the United Nations has put forward 17 sustainable development goals to be achieved by the year 2030. The 7th goal pertains to the transition to clean energy sources. Now, our choice of Alberta's oil and gas industry as a research site has been further motivated by an interest in the urgency of this global energy transition. So this is a phenomenon which is particularly consequential for the oil and gas sector of Alberta. And such issues, we found, seem inextricably associated with the province's social fabric. I would now like to set the context for the lens that we use in our research to look at the issue of oil and gas liabilities. Now, organization theory, as we can see in the slide, is the lens through which we are studying this issue. Organizations are ubiquitous. They are everywhere. And it is this ubiquity of organizations that forms the central concern of the field of study in which we situate our work. Now, organization theory has two main starting points: the sociology of organizations, which pertains to understanding these organizations, and classical management theory, which pertains to managing these organizations as distinct social formations or groups. We use various theoretical frameworks under organization theory to study the puzzles that we see in organizational life, what we call empirical phenomena. One such framework is the institutional logics framework, which we use in our research in this particular project. Logics can be defined as guiding principles of social and organizational life that we use to make sense of the world and how to act in the world. Now, these logics are a framework that help us researchers to frame or rationalize collective action in organizations. I wanted to spend a minute or two talking about the institutional logics framework because that is the framework on which we situate our work today and will be important to understand what we're doing here. So specifically, I wanted to talk about 7 ideal types or specific logics that have been laid out in the literature and used by researchers to identify the logics that they see in their particular empirical settings. Now, this typology of ideal types was offered to help researchers with their scientific inquiry into particular settings. Now, these 7 types are also called societal logics because they operate at a higher level. As you can see on your slide, these are the family logic, the community logic, the religion logic, the state logic, the market logic, the professional logic, and the corporation logic. Now, these are different from one another because they differ fundamentally along certain categories, which are also explained by the literature when the framework was formed. For the purposes of explanation, I have handpicked 2 logics along the columns of the table that you see on your slide. And these logics are the family logic and the market logic, and 3 of the categories that describe these logics along the rows of this table. Now, these categories help us understand how the family logic and the market logic differ from each other in organizational context in this particular example. As indicated in the table, the foundation of legitimacy, or what is socially acceptable, are different for the two logics. Now, the basis of legitimacy in the family logic is whether or not is unconditional loyalty. Whether or not that exists defines how legitimate the logic would be. In the market logic, on the other hand, legitimacy is accorded on the basis of transaction, whether or not there is a give and take relationship. The second category that we talk about is the basis of attention, or what is taken notice of. Under the family logic, the basis of attention lies in status within the household, whereas in the market logic, the basis of attention lies in status in the market, within the market. And the third category that I want to talk about today is the basis of strategy, or what is the overall goal in the context that we're talking about. In the case of the family logic, for example, the basis of strategy is increase in family honor. That's the overall goal that we tend to work towards. Whereas in the market logic, the strategy is increase in profit. Overall then, using the institutional logics framework, in this project, we were motivated to empirically examine the transformation that seems to have occurred in Alberta's oil and gas industry. As shown by the image on your left, of oil exploding from the Leduc #1 well in 1947 and people thronging to watch the spectacle, we were earlier seeped in the logic of a relentless emphasis on profits. But as shown by this more recent image of an orphaned well signage in Castleland, Alberta, we are now in an era where liability considerations have transformed the predominantly profit-making or extractive logic. How did this transformation happen? This was the question that intrigued us. And we were interested in investigating into the processes behind this transformation. To do so, we use the theoretical framework offered by the institutional logics perspective, and our research question then becomes, how did the institutional logics in Alberta's oil and gas industry transform? I wanted to give you a sense of the research design that we have used in this project. So we use what is called a longitudinal and inductive process study. By longitudinal, we mean that our study covers an extensive time period. So it goes from 1938 to 2019. And the kind of data or the data sources that we use are archival documents, which includes regulatory documents, which I will get to in a moment, in-person interviews, which we conducted between 2019 and 2020 before the pandemic struck. We have 38 in-person interviews, which form a good part of the data. And we also have 75 archival interviews, which were conducted between 1980 and 1985. I wanted to give you a sense of what an inductive study means. So under an inductive study, and this is how our research design, what our research design is basically premised on, these are the 5 steps, iterative and often concurrent steps that occur. So it involves collection of data from the sources that I just talked about, creation of categories, example, time periods, meanings, organization types, etc., from analyzing the data that we collected. Then the third step, which is often concurrent, as I mentioned, is checking the existing literature to select a suitable theoretical framework. And the fourth step is developing theory, that is moving from specific observations to broader generalizations, right? And the fifth step, which is iterations, is essentially going back to step 1 and doing all of this over again until we achieve what is called theoretical saturation. And I want to emphasize again that these steps are not sequential, but most of the time they are simultaneously happening. So getting into our data analysis, So this is the first step that we used in this project. And in process studies, we inherently deal with what we called messy data. This means that the data is not usually neatly sliced, but the researcher uses analytical strategies to delineate. In this case, we delineated our time of study into 5 periods or regulatory tenures. And these were marked by specific events in Alberta's regulatory history, which started in 1938 with the formation of the Petroleum and Natural Gas Conservation Board. So between 1938 and 1971, which marks the second milestone event of the formation of a regulatory regime, is the first time period that we consider. So the second event is the formation of the Energy Resource Conservation Board in 1971. The third is the Energy Utilities Board formation in 1995, followed by the reorganization of the Energy Utilities Board into the ERCB again, or the Energy Resource Conservation Board again. And the fifth and final milestone event is the formation of the Alberta Energy Regulator in 2013. So our final time period includes the years 2013 and 2019, the time between these 2 years. So during the 5 tenures, we started by an extensive study of regulatory documents issued by the particular provincial regulatory agency in that phase that I talked about in the previous slide. And these documents were called by various names, as you can see in this timeline. So in the 1940s, there were predominantly production reports and disposition reports that we consulted. Between the 1950s and the 1960s, these names changed, and the way the data was organized and the way the data was presented also changed. And there were various names allocated to these documents as well, such as memos, allowables, orders. There were conservation project reports, specific company review reports, reports on natural reserves, etc. And from the 1970s onwards, consistently, we relied on what were called technical directives issued by the provincial regulator during those times. So what we find from our study of these regulatory documents is that there were 2 patterns to the practices mandated or recommended by regulation and the underlying beliefs that accompanied those mandates and recommendations. In the first period between 1938 and the beginning of the 1990s, regulations were directed towards practices supporting drilling efficiency, accuracy, and the avoidance of wastage. So the rationale during this period was conservation of the resource and maintaining equity, for example, within subsurface pools of oil and gas as decisions of extraction were made. In other words, the logic during this period was what we are calling an extractive one, with practices that supported the rationale of efficiency and conservation. In the second and latter period, on the other hand, the regulations pointed towards a different pattern of practices and beliefs. Here, the rationale was accountability of the operators of oil and gas wells, and extraction that took into account considerations pertaining to a broader set of stakeholders and potential impacts on them. So newer terminology related to well types, technologies, and professions were seen to have come up. And liabilities in various forms and shapes and practices to uphold the rationale of liability management were becoming more pronounced. So we call this latter period logic as the liability logic. Although we were seeing these patterns of practices and beliefs during these 2 time periods, the next question that arose was a methodological one. How do we show that this was a case of logic transformation? To show this, we used computational methods using Stata, which is a software application. So we input the contents of the regulatory documents into the software, and the output produced by the software showed us various themes or topics of regulation. I'm showing 4 of these topics on this slide. The top two pertain to the extractive logic, and the bottom two pertain to the liability logic. As you can see in the two topics on top here, making applications for energy faster and smoother and reducing wastefulness arising from the economics of production were indicative of what we called the extractive logic. Note that these themes are present not only towards the beginning, but also towards the later years of our study. However, the two bottom topics, which were indicative of what we call the liability logic, only emerged in the later years, right? As you can see from the spikes here, and were nearly absent in the early years. So the examples of this logic or of the themes in this logic are, making technical guidelines available for well abandonment, reclamation, and liability management, and ensuring safety and environmental protection from effects of upstream petroleum. So this method helped us establish that what we were seeing in our data was indeed logic transformation and not merely displacement. That is, the extractive logic persists in the industry in the later years, but in a transformed way. In this table, I show some examples of theoretical categories that we identified, helping us to rationalize and to show the differences between the two logics that we found. As we can see here, in the extractive logic, the associated societal logic was more related to the market and the corporation, one of the 7 logics that I talked about a few slides ago, whereas in the liability logic, it was more connected with the societal logics of the community or the natural environment. The core objective in the extractive logic was to extract as efficiently as possible, and in the liability logic, it was to extract as responsibly as possible. The number of stakeholder organizations in the earlier logic were fewer than those in the later logic. And the role of the oil and gas operator and the regulator also changed. In the earlier logic, their role was mainly to manage the operations of oil and gas extraction efficiently and minimize wastages, whereas in the later logic, in the liability logic, it was to manage extraction responsibly and adhere to set liability management requirements. Okay, so I'm going to take a break now, but before that, I wanted to summarize what I talked about so far. Just to jog our memories a bit, our question in this project is, how did Alberta's oil and gas industry transform? Our research design is a longitudinal and an inductive one. We started off with the regulatory documents, which showed us different practices and beliefs during the 2 periods. And we demonstrated using topic modeling or using computational methods that this is a case of logic transformation. After we come back from the break, we're going to talk about what caused the shift in practices and beliefs. That is, what was the process that we're trying to theorize about here? And I'm happy to pass on to Valerie, and let's take some questions and get this discussion going.
Wonderful. So everyone who is here, please feel free to share your questions in the chat. If you want to raise your hand and ask yourself, you are welcome to. But our first question is, when defining logics for industry, do you weigh facts more like actions or motivations?
Okay, so the question is, when we are looking at these logics, do we weigh facts more or motivations? I don't know if I understand exactly what they mean by motivations, but to us, facts or truth is represented in what is mentioned in the regulatory documents. So whatever has been mandated or recommended by regulations is usually what is followed in practice by the oil and gas operators as well. Now, whether or not the practices are followed to the T, or whether or not, or whether they are followed in a different spirit is a different question. But to us, the facts that we see are represented in the regulatory documents, and that is the way the first part of our research has unfolded. I don't know if that answers your question, but whoever asked it is welcome to clarify further.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think that leads to a great kind of follow-up question of institutional logics is based on what is in the regulatory documents, what is being mandated. How do you deal with the fact that maybe what's in the documents isn't actually what is being done in industry or in another organization? How do you kind of balance that in your assessments?
That's an excellent question, and that's part of my my plan for my dissertation going forward as well. As I mentioned, this project forms one of the motivating chapters. We call these chapters in our dissertation. And in this particular project, we are more interested in looking at the higher order belief systems or the way that logics pan out because of how practices and beliefs occur in clusters and how practices and beliefs really come about and create value in different time periods of our investigation. But I think it's a great point that practices that actually pan out may or may not be equivalent to what the regulatory documents mention. And that is definitely something that we will take care of. It's on my plate for the future. But in this particular project, we are looking at theoretically what are the logics that have worked out over the years and what we can learn from the way that this transformation has occurred.
Okay, thank you so much. Another question kind of about your process. You have no interviews for the early part of your project because it is so long ago. Does that present a challenge when you're doing your research, when you're comparing such different data sets from across time?
Yeah, thank you for this excellent question. And this was one of the challenges that we faced when finalizing our research design. But the archival interviews that I talked about were conducted between 1980 and 1985. And these interviews really were retrospective interviews in which oil and gas executives who were actually in the field working and dealing with these various things as they emerged in the 1940s and 1950s, spoke about their experiences. So in that way, the archival documents presented gave us a good proxy for that, for the data that we were seeing currently and how that might have panned out in the earlier years. So that's how we took care of it.
Okay, awesome. And when you're doing these assessments, you're looking at a span from kind of 1938 to now-ish.
Yeah.
What's the usual duration of an industry logic? You've seen that it switched, that there's been two kind of over that period. How often or quickly do they usually change, or is it highly variable between different industries and what is happening?
Absolutely. I mean, for sure, it will vary by industry. But one thing that we need to keep in mind when we talk about logics and we talk about using logics as an analytical framework is that it is a framework that we use to answer the questions that are interesting to us in the field. So in our case, we were interested in learning about a transformation that seemed to be a long drawn one in Alberta. And that is why we use the logics framework in a way that allows us to segregate it into two different logics. But because the framework allows you to use institutional logics to see how various practices, beliefs, and various symbolic elements play out across contexts and across fields, it can vary. So in our case, it was 8 decades. In certain other industries, it may be as short as, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, maybe. But usually, in longitudinal studies such as these, I want to say that, the standard duration is usually, 5-ish years at least, not less than that.
Things don't change quickly most of the time. It takes time to build up those changes and to have that switch to an entirely different kind of set of beliefs and principles.
Yeah.
Do you find that that amount of time varies between those different ideal? I think you said there were 7 ideal types. Are there certain, like a family-based one versus a market versus community? Do you find that some change more quickly than others?
That's a very interesting question. I have to go back to the literature and check what has been done. But from memory or from whatever I have read so far, not all of these logics have been studied extensively in an organizational setting. For example, from off the top of my mind, I cannot think about a family logic, for example, having been studied, and I may be completely wrong here, but of all the 7 ideal type logics, I think it is the market logic, the community logic, the professional logic, the corporate logic that we see playing out most often in the business organizations that we usually choose to study. And yes, they do vary, depending on the logic.
Okay, thank you everyone for all these questions. The next one is, the oil sands employ everyone from workers on site to CEOs making millions of dollars. They all have wildly different perspectives and relationships with the industry. How do you make one set of logics that encompasses all of those different perspectives?
Great question again, thank you. So I want to clarify that my study is not on the oil sands. This is specifically about the oil and gas, the pump jack kind of paraphernalia that we see on the field. But when we do a study of this kind, and when we set out to identify the stakeholders, we usually identify them based on the different stakeholder type of organizations that they represent. So this question refers to people working in the oil companies as operators of the oil companies, but that's just one part of the story. We also have included 6 or 7 other types of stakeholder organizations, and I'll get to that in the second half of the presentation. But yes, constructing meanings out of the interview data is really something that that requires you to go through many perspectives and understand those perspectives, not only from the person's view, the person who's giving you the information, but also from the view of corroborate those views with the other data sources that you have in this kind of a research design. So, a bit of this and a bit of that, and lots of meaning making and lots of interpretation is involved.
Okay. I think we'll do one last question right now, and then we will get back into it. If you have more questions, please share them in the chat, either to myself or to Cassidy or to the whole group. The last question, again, is kind of getting back to your research process. You're doing a longitudinal and inductive study. Is that the common type of study for this research, or are there a lot of different research methods for this kind of institutional logic study?
Great question again, thank you. This is just one type of research. So a longitudinal process-based research design, I wouldn't say is, well, I wouldn't make a comment on whether or not it's common or uncommon, but it's definitely one of the many ways of doing qualitative research. And in terms of institutional logics as a framework, I think the strength of this framework is that it really allows you to use many different kinds of methods and many different kinds of research designs to unravel what you're seeing on the field by using this framework. So there have been quantitative studies, extended time periods and, time series kinds of data, regression studies. There have been qualitative studies which are not necessarily process-based or longitudinal research design-based, but this is definitely one of the ways that logics have been studied, although it may not be entirely, that common for sure.
Wonderful. There's so many different ways to unravel the puzzle that is figuring out the logics. All right, we're going to let you get back into it. If you have more questions, let us know and we can answer them at the end. Thank you so much, Bandita.
Thank you so much for these questions. Please keep them coming. Okay, so let's get back to the process of logic transformation, or to the probing of what caused the shift in practices and beliefs. So first, I want to show you some examples of events that we found to be consequential to this shift. As we can see on the slide, these events occurred in the wider institutional context. So the ones described in the maroon or red colored text boxes pertain to global events such as the Second World War, membership in international associations, salience of environmental disasters related to oil and gas, and global economic downturns. And the events in the green colored text boxes pertain to more local or Albertan events, which occurred sort of in tandem with the global events. For example, oil discoveries and subsequent establishment of boom towns in Alberta in the 1940s, and widespread immigration to the province during the 1940s and the 1950s, the legitimation of the field of geology, and more recently, the spate of bankruptcies in Alberta during the 2000s and the 2010s. So the point of the slide and the point of explaining this to you is that by examining the wider institutional context, we were finding that events of global significance had implications for events of more local or more Albertan consequence, and these events had were consequential to our overall process model of remaking worth. And we will come back to this when I talk about the model at the end of the presentation. So until this point, and this really talks about one of the questions that came up in the break about the kind of stakeholder groups that we used for our interviews. So until this point, our analysis was restricted to archival data, to reading, regulatory documents, books, media reports, etc. But at this stage, we moved our analysis from regulatory texts to different actors involved or different stakeholders involved beyond the regulator and how they were part of the change. So we asked, so these are the various stakeholder groups that we identified and that we interviewed. So they included surface rights owners, activists and environmentalists, surface rights groups, of course, regulatory agencies. We interviewed academic experts, people who had been steeped in this field for a long time, learning about these processes, independent research groups, oil companies, and in general, the Albertan public that was very much a stakeholder to this issue. So we asked our respondents questions pertaining to their work experiences. We asked them about their perspectives regarding the oil and gas sector's historical trajectory in Alberta. And this is where the retrospective view that I talked about also came to play. So we asked, although we were interviewing people in the present times, we did ask them about their perspectives regarding the historical trajectory. We asked them about their experiences collaborating with other stakeholder groups and organizations. And based on what our respondents were telling us and what we were gathering from the archival documents as well, because all of this is going on simultaneously as part of the research design, we constructed meanings from our interview data. And all the time, we keep our research question in mind and we corroborate the facts from the archival documents with the meanings that we were constructing from the interviews as well. So as we constructed meanings, we probed the practices and beliefs further. And these were the practices and beliefs that had been emerging in our data since the very first stage of our analysis. So in this diagram, where I show a few examples of these practices and beliefs, the text in italics represents the beliefs that we coded from our data, and the non-italicized text shows the practices. So what was interesting to us was that the practices and beliefs occurred in clusters, right? So for example, the belief that extractive principles bring economic prosperity was followed by the practice of buying large tracts of land by the oilmen, a practice that was called land portfolio management at that time. So we noticed that these belief practice clusters occurred throughout a period of study. And the practices always followed the beliefs, except for a few instances where they were simultaneously occurring. Now, these kind of observations or analysis of how things occur and the pattern in which things occur are very important for qualitative research, and they help us to theorize about the overall big picture question that we are asking in our research. So at this point, we formulated a theoretical construct that we labeled as bases of worth, which undergirded the clusters of practices and beliefs that I talked about. So in other words, these bases of worth were foundational to the value that people found in the clusters of practices and beliefs. So we identified these bases of worth from the narratives that pre-existed the beliefs. And I want to point out here that this concept is a theoretical one, and it helped us make sense of how the belief practice clusters were emerging. And we identified 3 patterns. Again, patterns and identification of patterns is important to this style of research. So we identified 3 patterns in the data that showed the emergence of bases of worth. So the first pattern was explicit discussions and debates around the value of values, or around the goods that matter. What counts as good at a more, at a higher level. So that was one of the first patterns we saw. Second, we notice evaluations of appropriate criteria for being. So styles of life, what style of life do you respect? Is what was being considered. For example, in the earlier logic, relentlessness or a pioneer spirit was venerated or was very respected, whereas in the later logic, the state of being a responsible executive, or the state of having a risk-managed portfolio, being an oil company, was more valued, right? So those are the kinds of patterns that we were emerging, which helped us identify the bases of worth. And third and finally, we noticed that the position of various subjects or actors, or the stakeholders, was also important, and those subject positions needed to be interrogated in order to arrive at a basis of worth. So in our context, during the first logic, or during the first basis of worth, there is a relatively sparse subject landscape, right? So the oil man was sort of the central character. But during the later logic, or during bases of worth 2, when the bases of worth 2 started emerging, new subject positions emerge. So the regulator is, kind of acted as the interceptor between the oilman, in this case, the oil company, and the various other stakeholders that were emerging. So it became clear to us at this time that logic transformation included evaluation of worth. And we became curious to investigate how worth was evaluated. And our rich data allowed us to do that. So in the next part of the presentation, I will be talking about how we came to understanding how worth was evaluated and how that played a role in the logic transformation. So overall, we found 4 mechanisms of evaluation of worth, and I will briefly explain how these make sense in the context of our overall process model by showing you various examples from the data in the following slides. But in this slide, I wanted to describe how the qualitative coding process aggregates interim codes into higher order codes through analysis and sense making of the data. So in our case, we found that the first 2 mechanisms, evaluating resource opportunities and confronting unintended consequences, pertained to pertained to questioning the worth of the practices and beliefs. And the third and fourth mechanisms, which we labeled harnessing emotional stakes and constructing perceptions of a desired state, pertained to justifying the worth of the practices and beliefs. Accordingly, we aggregated the first two mechanisms into a category called interrogating worth, and the second two into a category that we labeled rationalizing worth. So these two categories of interrogating worth and rationalizing worth were present during both periods, the extractive logic to the left of your screen and the liability logic to the right of your screen. So I will now offer you some quotes from our data to give you a sense of how they led to our process theory of transformation. Now, under the category of interrogating worth, then, let us look at the first quote under extractive logic. It says, computerization has changed how work gets done in the industry. What used to be done by seismologists can now be done by managers thanks to technology. So this quote sort of was interrogating the professional practices that were going on in the field at that time, right? Now, the second quote says, technicalities get complicated in Alberta because of the lease terms. Everything is separated into horizons, and when you get a lease, it's only down to a certain depth. So by saying this, what was being pointed out was that the complications in legislation was sort of being questioned or confronted, right? So these two quotes sort of gave us a sense of a sub-process that was happening here, which we labeled as dismantling worth. So this process of dismantling worth really entails the bases of worth of the existing extractive logic were being torn down or were being gradually brought down. So that was what these quotes were showing us. Now, let's turn to the liability logic. Here, the first quote that I wanted to show an example of is, certain liability management initiatives imply killing the golden goose for landowners by robbing them of rent and infrastructure. So by saying this, what the meaning that we made out of this was that land ownership issues were being problematized, and by incorporating liability management, the way that this was a problem for landowners was pointed out, right? Similarly, here's another quote that says, the establishment of the orphan fund levy signaled to companies that they would not be held accountable for assets that they passed over to another company. So what this quote was doing was it was questioning regulatory decisions that were considered short-sighted or that were considered, not really conducive to the overall spirit of liability management. So what these quotes were telling us was that there was a process or a sub-process of trivializing that was going on, whereby the bases of worth of the new liability logic are reduced in importance, right? They are sort of made small matter of even as they begin to take shape. The next label that I wanted to talk about was that of rationalizing worth, in which we are basically talking about why something makes sense. So under the extractive logic, the first example quote I have here is, my family were all born, raised, and educated in Turner Valley, and today they're all gainfully employed in their various fields. So oil's been good, I'd say. So what this quote meant to us was that a pride in Alberta's resources was being expressed. So it was being so the people were making sense of how the oil and gas resource was good for Alberta and how it stood Alberta in good stead, right? So another similar quote here is valorizing the culture of the oil industry or of the sector as a whole. It says, take chances and you will be rewarded. So long as you're in an oil area, you should get yourself large tracts of land because eventually it's going to turn up trumps. It's a remarkable fact. So what these quotes were telling us was that worth rationalization during the extractive logic period constitutes a process that we are calling fortifying. Okay, whereby the bases of worth of the existing extractive logic are strengthened even as they begin to dismantle. So by interrogating worth, there was a dismantling process that was going on, but it was being counteracted by this process of fortifying. Let's turn our attention to the liability logic and how rationalizing worth happened in the liability logic. So the first quote here says, we have all imaginable laws supporting liability management, but the industry's influence stopped important reforms considered very early from ever happening. So what was happening here is that the industry's power over the other stakeholders was being resented, and this resentment was being expressed, right? We have all the imaginable laws, but still nothing's happening because the industry's influence is stopping those reforms from happening. Another example is this complaint of, Alberta is facing the repercussions of a 28-year-old decision, which confused the understanding of the polluter pays principle by conceptualizing an orphan fund levy instead. So here what was being done was that what could be was being rationalized over what is. So basically this was like constructing the perception of a desired state and really putting liability management on a pedestal, right? So this is why the processes that were being represented by these quotes, we call these deifying. So because liability management was sort of put on a pedestal, and the benefits in it were being rationalized. So deifying is the process whereby the bases of worth of the new liability logic begin to be built up and start to take shape. Finally, here is the process model of remaking worth. You might recall some of the labels on this model from what I presented in the preceding slides, but even if you don't, the key takeaway from this process model is that the transformation of the oil industry consisted of a process by which worth was remade throughout the years under investigation. So in this model, a top-down institutional effect is constituted by the global cultural regime, made up, among others, by events of global economic, environmental, and geopolitical significance. And the bottom-up effect on the model is made up of processes of evaluation of worth, right? And finally, the core of the process consists of the four sub-processes of remaking worth. That is, dismantling and fortifying during the earlier time period denoted by T1, and deifying and trivializing in the later time period denoted by T2, respectively. Okay, so this brings me to the final leg of this presentation. And I want to spend these final minutes talking about the potential implications of the findings from the study towards policy and towards organizational decision-making in general. So the first and most important finding from the study so far is that the transformation of the oil and gas industry in Alberta over these 8 years, over these 8 decades under examination, shifts in broader belief systems or shifts in questions of worth were consequential, as they were found to be linked to changes in the various practices. And although I want to point out here that our findings are still emerging, and we will not be able to pinpoint the exact implications of our study on policy at this moment, but I wanted to share examples of past studies to provide a sense of the kind of impact that we're talking about here, and hopefully the kind of direction that we are going towards. The first example that I wanted to share is that of a relatively recent excellent study conducted in 2015 by Lee and Lounsbury in the context of toxic waste management across industrial facilities in the US. So using the institutional logics perspective, their findings had substantial implications for policy dilemmas related to how environmental performance varies according to geography in the US. So that is, some places adopted certain waste management practices more or less than other places. So the findings from their study really had some great points to offer, to explain that phenomenon. Now, the second finding from our study shows that global and local institutional events have a top-down effect on the overall transformation of the oil and gas industry. And here I wanted to cite two very influential studies in our field, which also underlined such wider institutional effects in particular contexts. The first study was conducted in 2003, and it was a study of the shift from classical cuisine to nouvelle cuisine in the French culinary world, and the effect of the chef's identity movements, which was something that was happening in the wider institutional context. So the effects of that movement on the transition. And the second classic study that I want to point out here was conducted in 1997, and it talked about the role of the progressive ideology on the changing forms of thrift organizations, which are a particular form of loan organizations during those times. We also think that our study could guide future decision-making by helping determine what issues need particular attention in the oil and gas industry. So in the past, several studies have used institutional logic's framework to make specific recommendations on certain aspects of organizing. And we hope to be able, as we move towards the completion of the study, we hope to be able to make certain specific recommendations as well. But here are a few examples of what happened in the past. So in 2010, a study of microfinance organizations was conducted. And it was recommended that a common organizational identity must be created by combining elements of constituent logics in a case of a complex environment where more than one logics were operating. And the second example that I want to point out here was a 1999 study of the higher education publishing industry. And in this study, it was shown that a change in logic in the industry had implications for executive succession, and recommendations with respect to executive succession was provided on the basis of those results. So as our study nears completion, we are hopeful of being able to provide suggestions that are directly relevant to the oil and gas industry and can be used to guide policy going forward. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, to the end of my slides. And I just want to thank you for being here all this while and for the great questions during the break. And I look forward to discussing more, hopefully, once Valerie takes over.
Thank you so much, Pandita. You can only see Cassie and I, but wild round of applause. Thank you so much. It's so interesting. My background is more on the biological sciences side, and it's so interesting to get into the social science and the process of how you look at it and the different kinds of questions that we're answering. So anyone in the audience, if you've got questions, pop them in the chat. But we do have a few questions. I know some of them are going to be related to things that you might not be able to answer yet because you're still early in your research, but we will throw them out there and see your thoughts. So number one is a COVID related question of how will COVID impact your research, both the process of doing your research, but also the actual outcomes? Has that influenced your data in any way?
That's such a great question. And that's something that immediately comes to mind for any PhD student who are doing their dissertation. So luckily for me, my research design is such that study of archival documents or the stash of archival interviews that I have will allow me to complete this study without having to, hopefully without having to have any more face-to-face interviews. But even if there arises the need to have face-to-face interviews, then I don't foresee a lot of problems because, part of the qualitative research process is also establishing connections with people that you've been working with in order to give shape to your work. And I have been lucky to have had established connections with some very active people in the field. So I I have no doubt that if I reach out to them, we can have a Zoom chat like this and talk about certain unanswered or certain other puzzles that may come up as I continue my analysis and as I continue writing up my findings. So yeah, I don't foresee a lot of major difficulties, but I do hope we get out of this COVID situation very soon.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, next question. How do the extractive logics of the oil and gas industry in Canada compare to those in other regions of the world, particularly with very different political or economic standards, such as Saudi Arabia? I know in one of your last slides, you were talking about it is both a global and a local. So the global impacts might be the same, but I guess those local would be very different.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And, this is a very complicated question and a great question. I've been thinking about that myself. In the context of my dissertation work, I have so far decided to bound my study to the confines of Alberta and really think about how the transformation happened in Alberta. But that is not to say that these things are not important or should not be taken into consideration. So far, I have tried to familiarize myself a bit with things in the US, things in Texas, for example, which has a similar culture. I will venture out to say without having a lot of data around this, but so far in my dissertation work, I have decided to restrict myself to Alberta, and therefore I do not have a lot of insight on that question at the moment. But whoever asked this question, I want to tell them that they're absolutely right, that things will look very different depending on the jurisdiction that you are putting your concentration on, and specifically with respect to Alberta, I'm trying to now think about the political ramifications behind this case, and this is one of the weaknesses so far in my research. I think that I have not really considered the political background of Alberta, and that may be a next step. I have been thinking about that. So.
I find that's always the thing about PhD research is you'll have all of the data and you'll be like, yeah, I got this. And then you're like, oh, there's like 1,000 more questions that I had not thought of until right now.
Exactly. And that's why these events such as these are so important and just so helpful for students such as me.
Absolutely. So this one's a little specific. So in your slide about the beliefs and the events that were paired, you had one about naming geographical formations. And that seemed to kind of stand out as a little bit random. So can you explain a little bit more about the naming of geographical formations?
Oh, sure. Yeah, that's one of my favorite codes, actually. And when I say codes, I mean, analysis of the various data points that we are getting. So naming of the various formations to us, naming of the various formations is the practice. And the belief that it is associated with is that, more and more information, the scientization of the information procurement process, or earlier during the years of the Leduc discovery, for example, in the 1940s and in the 1950s, things were not as organized and things were not as categorized as they were going forward. So the meaning of that code is that going forward in the oil and gas industry, things started getting more and more, discipline bound. So there were more and more nomenclatures coming up. There was more and more awareness of the fact that, things need to be more organized and more scientized. And that is what I tried to show with that practice. So the belief, the corresponding belief, I don't remember exactly what the words were, but the corresponding belief is about, the scientization, the emerging scientization that was coming up as we were going through the years.
Okay, thank you. I was very curious about that. It was such an interesting fact. Okay, next question. Have you seen this shift from extractive logics to liability logics in other industries or in other institutions?
This is very interesting. Well, I do know that there was this very famous case that was made, I think, in organizational literature about the chemical industry having gone through this in the 1980s, I want to say, but I will double check that. But the chemical industry definitely went through this, where, and the word extractive here does not necessarily have to have a literal meaning, but extractive here refers to getting the most that you can get out of the resource. So the chemical, I am aware of studies being done in the chemical industry where a liability management mindset has taken over the extractive mindset. But I think this has happened in many other industries as well. But to my knowledge, I only know about the chemical industry where specific studies have been conducted, but I'm not aware at the moment of any other industries. But I'm sure liability management, which is really about the societal logic of community and natural environment, has taken over in many industries now, owing to the era of being mindful about sustainability that we are in at the moment.
It would be very interesting to do a study that looks at when that shift was in all these different industries and how that varies geographically around the world, to see if there's a geographical and political impact. Next question. So you were mentioning that you still want to look at kind of the political background of Alberta in relation to your research, but have you looked at the kind of energy transition in your research and how that relates to it? So have the oil and gas logics been impacted by the rise of renewable energy, and how has that impacted it?
Yes, that's also something that I have not taken a look at the moment. But when I talk about, and I've talked about the global cultural regime and the environmental movement, and that kind of includes all of these the renewable energy drive and the energy transition that's happening at the moment. So yes, those things have been included under the umbrella of these wider institutional processes, but I have not gone into fine-grained details of these events or of these various changes. But if the research design calls for that going forward, as I get deeper into my theorization and prepare, for my final dissertation, then that's definitely something that I might take into consideration as well. So thank you very much for that question and comment.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody in the audience, for all of your great questions. Again, if there are any last questions, pop them in the chat. We've got a couple last ones. Your research began with the idea of orphaned wells in Alberta, that's where you started us with. Do you see your research linking back to that in the end, in providing those recommendations with what you find out in the end? How do you see yourself linking back to those orphaned wells?
Absolutely. I mean, the orphan wells and the inactive well, the suspended well problem, and the various terminologies associated with Alberta's oil and gas industry of even naming and categorizing these different wells was what started us off on this project. And we definitely want to touch back upon those starting points when we finish this project. And at the moment, I'm sort of looking at it from the perspective of policy recommendations. What is it that we could have done differently to have avoided, this burgeoning problem of orphaned oil wells, this establishment of the orphan fund levy? What could have been done differently? What are the problems that have arisen from having done it the way that we did it, and what we can carry forward in the energy transition era as we move forward with renewable energies, for example. So I foresee the recommendations from that perspective being really helpful for policy. And I really hope that we are able to do that. But things are looking okay so far, and I'm hopeful.
We'll just have to bring you back in a couple of years once you've got all the research finished so we can find out all of those policy recommendations.
Absolutely. I would love to do that.
Awesome. My last question actually was going to be, this is quite different than what we've hosted before with Energy Talks, where we've generally more focused on the technology and the more biological science. And you've really highlighted the importance of institutional logics. I just want to give you the opportunity to say any last comments about the value of this type of research in kind of that energy transition sphere to really guide where we can go in the future. So I just want to give you a chance at the end to kind of wrap up any thoughts before we wrap up.
Sure. Thank you. I think this is, as I said before, organizational theory as a lens really allows us to see, the meanings behind organizing and the way to manage organizations and the way to take into account macro or big picture issues and events, and sort of take that into consideration when we think about the more micro elements of our day-to-day organizing. So, the technological advancements that we have and how those, might pan out a decade or so from now are things that need to be considered at the moment. And organization theory and institutional logics in particular, in the context of this research, really allows us to take a step back, to take a step up, actually, and look at it from a big picture perspective. So, to give you an example, hydraulic fracturing, right? It was a technology, it is a technology that revolutionized the way oil exploration takes place or had taken place. But it has also been argued, and research has shown that the way it was operationalized might have had implications for the way that this whole energy transition issue was exacerbated to an extent. So the way that organizing and the way that the coming together of these practices can be managed better is definitely something that organization theory is very interested in. And I think that's also something that must be taken into consideration when planning, when strategizing, and yeah, that's about it. That's all I wanted to say. And as I said before, implications for policy are really is really something that organization theory and this style of research can help us with going forward, not only in the energy sector, but in organizing as a whole.
Absolutely. I love those comments. Thank you again, Bandita. That was a wonderful talk. Again, wild round of applause for everyone you can't see.
Thank you so much.
And thank you everyone for joining us. I know it is a lovely sunny day in July, and we are so happy that you are here with us. Our next Energy Talk is going to be in September. I'm just sharing the link in the chat. It is going to be on greenhouse gas zero fuels produced from water, sunlight, and carbon dioxide. So please join us for that. It will be part of Energy Week, so you'll see lots of different events that week, and we hope you'll join us. Thank you again from Future Energy Systems. We hope to see you again. Have a wonderful August. Cassidy, any last comments from the library?
Just wanted to say thank you again and let folks know that there will be a feedback survey coming tomorrow in a follow-up email. Normally I would put it in the chat for you right now, but unfortunately our survey provider is inaccessible this evening. So you'll get an email from me, and it's going to have all of the links to Bandita's other work, to Future Energy Systems, to our upcoming one. So if you want to join us when we come back for our next speaker series or our next speaker event in September, don't worry, I'm going to send it to you so you don't miss out. And thank you so much. Like Valerie said, it is a lovely evening, and we really appreciate you spending that time with us, and hope that you will join us again in the future.
Thank you, everyone. If you do have any last questions that you didn't get to ask, we will stick around for a couple minutes, but have a wonderful evening.
Thank you so much, everyone.